Real Genius is not a comedy about smart kids winning. It's a story about how intelligence gets recruited, controlled, and quietly turned into a weapon. Behind the pranks, the sarcasm, and the popcorn lies a far darker idea. When brilliance is rewarded too early and questioned too late, it stops being freedom. It becomes labor. It becomes leverage. It becomes something powerful people know how to use. This movie doesn't ask whether genius is impressive. It asks what happens when genius is obedient. That's why Real Genius still feels unsettling, not because of its jokes, but because it understands a truth most films avoid. Intelligence doesn't become dangerous when it's aggressive. It becomes dangerous when it's useful. And every strange decision behind this film was shaped by that realization. Number 1. Real Genius was almost turned into the exact kind of movie it now quietly criticizes. In the early stages of development, Real Genius wasn't supposed to be thoughtful, restrained, or even particularly respectful of intelligence. It was being molded to fit a formula Hollywood already knew would sell. At the time, raunchy campus comedies were exploding. Studios wanted smart characters, but only as punchlines, excuses for sex jokes, humiliation gags, and shallow chaos. Intelligence wasn't something to explore, it was something to mock. The first versions of the script leaned directly into that trend. The tone treated genius as a novelty, not a worldview. On paper, it looked safe, familiar, profitable, but that safety was exactly the problem. When Martha Coolidge stepped in as director, she didn't remove the comedy. She recalibrated it. The goal wasn't to make the film smarter, it was to stop it from becoming lazy. Cheap jokes were cut, characters were reshaped, humor stopped coming from belittling intelligence and started coming from watching intelligent people struggle with pressure, responsibility, and fear. That shift changed everything. Real Genius stopped being a movie that laughed at smart people and became a movie that laughed with them and sometimes at the systems trying to use them. This decision didn't just save the film's tone, it gave the story a spine, one that refused to flatten intelligence into spectacle. And without that pivot, none of what followed would have mattered. Number 2. Once the tone was rescued, the film made a second decision that mattered just as much. It refused to treat intelligence as decoration. After steering Real Genius away from cheap comedy, the creative team faced a quieter but more dangerous risk. If the movie joked about prodigies building weapons, it couldn't afford to sound careless about how those weapons worked. The premise was already balancing on a thin wire. A group of college students recruited to design a laser precise enough to strike a human-sized target from space could instantly collapse into nonsense if handled lazily. One wrong line of dialogue, one sloppy explanation, and the entire story would feel like a cartoon. Martha Coolidge understood that problem early, so instead of simplifying the science for laughs, she made a rule that quietly governed the entire production. Reality could bend, but it could never be lazy. The laser didn't have to be literally possible. What mattered was that the thinking behind it sounded like something intelligent people would actually argue about in a real room. That meant research, consultants, studying places like Caltech and MIT, absorbing the culture of elite academic pressure and military-adjacent ambition. That obsession shows up in details most movies would ignore. Pacific Tech isn't a fantasy campus. It's a reflection of real institutions where brilliance is both celebrated and harvested. Dorm graffiti was copied from real campus walls and then sharpened by actual students. Even the idea of a genius living underground wasn't random. It echoed long-standing university legends about prodigies who vanish into tunnels, labs, and isolation. The comedy works because the world feels grounded. The jokes don't laugh at intelligence itself. They laugh at what intelligence gets dragged into once money, power, and secrecy enter the room. Real Genius never asks the audience to suspend disbelief. It asks them to recognize a system they already understand. Number 3. The movie had the brains. What it still needed was a heartbeat, and that heartbeat almost belonged to someone else. For a while, Chris Knight wasn't Val Kilmer. The role was circling actors who could play clever, sarcastic, and approachable. John Cusack was the leading idea. He had the timing, the charm, the familiar rebellious intelligence audiences already trusted. Then he passed. Suddenly, Real Genius had a problem no amount of research could fix. Without the right Chris Knight, the film risked turning into homework, with punchlines technically smart, emotionally flat. Val Kilmer didn't solve that problem by fitting in. He solved it by disrupting the room. During his audition, he didn't try to charm the producers, he challenged them. When introduced to Brian Grazer, Kilmer reportedly dismissed him with a line so arrogant it should have ended the meeting on the spot. Instead, it did the opposite. Because it wasn't arrogance for attention, it was a live demonstration of the character. Chris Knight isn't impressed by titles. He doesn't perform respect on command. He disarms authority by treating it as already irrelevant. Kilmer wasn't reading lines. He was embodying the worldview the film needed. That energy carried onto the screen. His performance isn't loud. It isn't desperate. It's detached, controlled, and slightly unreachable. And that distance reads as intelligence. The refusal to beg for approval becomes both the joke and the weapon. Placed against Professor Hathaway's polished, institutional authority, the contrast becomes the film's core conflict. One man believes power comes from structure and obedience. The other knows power collapses when it stops being feared. Without Kilmer's presence, that dynamic disappears. The movie loses its pulse. With him, it gains something rarer than comedy or cleverness. It gains resistance. Number 4. One of the film's most outrageous genius moments wasn't invented for comedy. It was borrowed from real academic exploitation. Laszlo Hollyfeld's infamous stunt feels absurd on first watch. A reclusive mind flooding a corporate contest with millions of entries until the system collapses under its own stupidity. It plays like exaggerated movie logic, except it wasn't exaggerated at all. The loophole Laszlo exploits was already well known among elite university students decades before Real Genius was made. If a promotion doesn't limit entries, it isn't a contest. It's a broken machine waiting to be abused. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, students at places like Caltech had already discovered this vulnerability. Early computers were used to mass-produce entries for giveaways, snacks, and cash prizes. What began as playful hacking quickly turned into something more serious. By 1975, programmers were using IBM systems to generate over 1 million contest submissions for a single promotion. The payoff was real. So was the fallout. Companies tightened rules. Legal departments stepped in. What looked like harmless cleverness suddenly became a threat. Real Genius didn't turn that history into a joke. It turned it into a warning. The punchline isn't that Laszlo is unstable. It's that the system invited him in. Intelligence didn't break the rules. It exposed how fragile they already were. Number 5. Jordan wasn't written as comic relief. She became proof that brilliance doesn't have to be cold to be powerful. Michelle Myrink's Jordan hits the screen like raw electricity. Fast-talking, sleep-deprived, mechanically gifted, and genuinely thrilled by ideas, she feels different from almost every female character in 1980s tech-centered films. She isn't there to soften the men. She isn't there to be impressed by genius. She is genius, messy, joyful, and fully alive. At a time when intelligent women were often written as either distant or decorative, Jordan became something rarer. Her intelligence is the engine of her personality. The humor doesn't come from her being awkward. It comes from her mind moving faster than the world around her. What makes her presence quietly important is what happened after the film. Years later, Disney writer and producer Tad Stones confirmed that Jordan helped inspire Gadget Hackwrench. The goggles, the tinkering, the warmth, the idea that brilliance could feel inviting instead of intimidating. Jordan didn't just work inside Real Genius. She echoed forward, one performance quietly shaping a character who would define intelligence for an entire generation of kids. That's not nostalgia, that's influence. Number 6. Before the film found its anxious genius, it almost cast someone who was actually living the nightmare. At one point, the filmmakers considered casting a real-life prodigy as Mitch Taylor, a teenager who had already graduated college and was headed toward law school. On paper, it sounded perfect. Reality delivered the warning. He couldn't act. That failure mattered more than it seemed, because Real Genius isn't about how impressive prodigies look from the outside. It's about how crushing that pressure feels from the inside. Gabriel Jarrett didn't play Mitch as exceptional. He played him as overwhelmed. As a kid, slowly realizing that being called brilliant doesn't protect you, it isolates you. That casting choice accidentally stitched Real Genius into a much larger cultural web. Years later, Jarrett appeared briefly in The Karate Kid Part 3, a strange visual irony for fans who remember Mitch as pure anxiety in human form. The connections didn't stop there. Yuji Okamoto, who played Fenton, went on to join The Karate Kid Part 2 and later returned in Cobra Kai. Even that series introduced characters named Chris and Mitch, the kind of deep-cut nod that only works if the legacy still matters. Jarrett's real life took a quieter turn. He left acting and became an advocate for the deaf community, eventually working as a sign language interpreter. The irony is fitting. A film about protecting intelligence from exploitation ended with its most fragile character choosing a life away from spectacle. Not every genius wants to be seen, and real genius understood that before most movies ever tried. Number 7. One of the film's most remembered moments became legendary precisely because most audiences weren't supposed to see it. For years, fans swore they remembered a scene that didn't officially exist. Chris Knight, floating outside a classroom, calmly reclining in a chair lifted by a cluster of helium balloons. Students staring up from below, unsure whether they were watching a prank or something close to magic. They weren't misremembering. The scene was fully shot. Rigging, wires, stunt coordination, all of it real. It even appeared in early trailers and played during test screenings, which is why its absence in the theatrical release felt so strange. No official explanation was ever stamped onto its removal, but the most convincing reason is also the simplest. The gag looked too easy to imitate. Teen audiences, balloons, gravity. One reckless copycat could turn a joke into a headline. So the scene was quietly pulled. That decision accidentally gave the moment more power than if it had stayed. It became a ghost scene, something half-remembered, debated, mythologized. Certain TV airings and home releases later restored it, which only deepened the confusion. Real genius didn't lose a moment. It gained a legend. And that fits the film perfectly. A story about intelligence leaving traces behind even when it's hidden. Proof that some ideas refuse to disappear just because authority tells them to. Number 8. The popcorn ending wasn't a gag, it was a logistical gamble disguised as joy. On screen, the final act feels playful, absurd, a victory lap made of popcorn and catharsis. Behind the scenes, it was one of the most difficult sequences the production attempted. The challenge wasn't the concept, it was scale. Enough popcorn had to be created to bury a house and still read on camera as a tidal wave, not a pile. The crew spent months popping it, building the first massive stockpile by hand. Even that wasn't enough. Outside suppliers had to be brought in to meet the volume the shot demanded. Then came the risks no one expects from popcorn. The kernels would be falling near hot lights, wiring, and equipment. Fire hazards were real, so the popcorn had to be treated with fire retardant. That solved one problem and created another. Treated popcorn could harm wildlife if animals got into it, birds especially. The set had to be guarded, covered, controlled. Not because it looked dangerous, but because it actually was. Even the house wasn't real. It was a structure built to be sacrificed, placed in an area already scheduled for construction. Because once the popcorn fell, there was no reset. Gravity only gives you one take. Years later, Mythbusters tested the idea. They confirmed what physics already suggests. Popcorn wouldn't destroy a house the way the film shows. But they also proved something important. Lasers can pop popcorn. The scene cheats on scale, not on spirit. And that balance, absurd yet grounded, is exactly why it works. Number 9. Real genius quietly stepped into the future before most of the world even realized it was there. In 1985, promoting a movie online sounded like science fiction. Most people didn't own a home computer worth mentioning. The internet was barely a rumor. Social media didn't exist. Websites didn't exist. Real genius went online anyway. About a week before the film's release, director Martha Coolidge and members of the cast participated in what was essentially an early online press conference. It took place inside a computer store in Westwood, California. Journalists from around the country sent questions electronically through CompuServe, one of the earliest consumer online services. There were no cameras, no live video, just text crawling in and answers crawling back out. By today's standards, it looks primitive. In 1985, it was borderline magical. Hollywood was selling a movie through a network instead of phones, faxes, or physical press junkets. Whether or not it was the first time a film tried this, it's widely considered one of the earliest examples. And the irony couldn't be cleaner. A movie about experimental thinking didn't just predict the future, it tested it, quietly, carefully, without fanfare. Real genius understood something before most studios did. Technology doesn't announce itself with fireworks. It arrives awkwardly, slowly, and then one day, everyone wonders how they lived without it. Number 10. 2 movies entered the same week. Only one understood what intelligence actually costs. Real Genius arrived in theaters on the 7th of August 1985. 5 days earlier, Weird Science had already landed. Same decade, same audience. Same surface-level promise. Teenagers, science, comedy. But beneath that similarity, the films were speaking entirely different languages. Weird Science treated science like a fantasy vending machine. Push the right buttons, reality bends, consequences disappear. The joke was freedom, power without weight. Real Genius took the opposite approach. It treated science like something that could actually work, and that made it uncomfortable. The laughs didn't come from wish fulfillment. They came from pressure, ego, ethical blind spots, and the creeping realization that a cool project might end up hurting real people. The box office reflected that divide. Weird Science pulled in close to $40 million. Real Genius earned around $13 million on a modest budget. Respectable, but quiet. No headlines. No instant legend. Then time intervened. Weird Science stayed tied to its moment. Real Genius kept getting rediscovered, quoted, rewatched, passed down. Not because it promised escape, but because it offered recognition. It didn't tell audiences what they wanted to hear. It told them what intelligence feels like when it's under control and when it finally pushes back. That's why one movie faded into nostalgia and the other became a cult that refuses to age. Even the marketing struggled to decide what kind of movie this really was. The promotional material for Real Genius tells its own quiet story of uncertainty. One poster placed Chris Knight beside Albert Einstein, as if to reassure audiences that, yes, this was a genius movie just with sarcasm. The promise was clever, slightly misleading, and harmless. Einstein, of course, never appears. He had been dead for decades, but the comparison did its job. Another poster leaned into chaos instead. Chris posed like a walking prank against a towering city backdrop. Less scientist, more troublemaker. Home video releases made things stranger. One later DVD cover used a Val Kilmer image that looked subtly wrong, stretched, smoothed, almost artificial. Not horrifying, but unsettling in a way you couldn't quite name. The irony is sharp. A movie about precision, thoughtfulness, and ethical intelligence ended up with marketing that felt just a little careless. Somewhere along the way, someone approved that image and moved on. Even genius projects can be undermined by shortcuts. Real Genius doesn't survive because it was funny. Plenty of funny movies disappear. It survives because it refused to be dumbed down. It let smart characters stay smart. It let comedy come from truth instead of humiliation. And it treated intelligence not as a costume, but as a burden that moves faster than the people carrying it. Beneath the sarcasm and the synths, the film understood something rare. Being brilliant doesn't make you invincible. It just means you feel pressure sooner, burnout faster, responsibility heavier. Sometimes genius doesn't save the world. Sometimes it just recognizes a bad system and decides not to serve it anymore. That's why Real Genius still matters. Not because it predicted the future, but because it warned us about it quietly, intelligently, and without ever asking to be liked. And maybe that's the most dangerous kind of intelligence there is.